Antonio, one can live a life of moderation by never deviating from the middle course. Okay, I don't know what exactly the middle course is, but I guess this makes sense. You stay in the middle, you never go off and do other things, and that's moderation. But then one loses the joy of spontaneity and misses the opportunities that come to those who are occasionally willing to take great chances or to go too far. Okay, if you follow this path of moderation, stay in the middle, then two things are going to happen. One, you're not going to have the joy that apparently comes from spontaneity, and you're going to miss some opportunities that make sense because you're like a lemming. You do just the simple, non-risky stuff. Okay, I don't really see an argument here. Antonio has just told us two things. Antonio hasn't even said whether a life of moderation is good or bad. I mean, Antonio has told us that there are these two things that sound bad. They will happen if you live a life of moderation. But there's no explicit conclusion saying, therefore, don't live a life of moderation, right? It just kind of stops. Okay, Marla, what does she say? But one who, in the interests of moderation, never risks going too far is actually failing to live a life of moderation. Okay, why? One must be moderate even in one's moderation. Okay, I guess if you always stay the middle course, right? There's something oddly not moderate about that. You're very consistent. You're lacking any sort of moderation in terms of inconsistency. Like you're strictly staying in the middle. Okay. I think I understand what both of them are saying. The question says Antonio and Marla disagree over. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and I'm going to make a prediction. What do I think they're disagreeing about? Marla is saying if you stay in the middle, right, you're not going to be moderate. You need moderation even in your moderation. But Antonio is saying one can live a life of moderation by never, I don't know why I didn't catch that the first time, but by never deviating from the middle course. That's oddly strong, right? So Antonio thinks you can live a life of moderation by staying in the middle. Marla is saying that's not a life of moderation. So they seem to be disagreeing about what makes something a life or makes a life of moderation. Do they disagree about whether it is desirable for people to occasionally take great chances in life? They don't talk about whether this is good or bad. Ultimately, this is one thing I was thinking about when I was evaluating Antonio's argument. He actually never makes a claim about whether you should live a life of moderation. So that's not going to work. B, what a life of moderation requires of a person. They do disagree about that. Antonio thinks that means you can never deviate from the middle course. Marla thinks you actually need to. So that sounds like the answer. C, whether it is possible for a person to embrace other virtues. Didn't talk about other virtues. Done. D, how often a person ought to deviate from the middle course in life. Marla doesn't even talk about that. How much should you or should you not do something? Antonio doesn't talk about what you should or shouldn't do either. So that's wrong. I could have stopped at the word ought. E, whether it is desirable. Again, I'm not going to read the rest of E. We didn't talk about what is desirable or what is good or what should happen. We just talked about what does in fact happen or what makes something a life of moderation. So the answer has got to be B. Questions on this question? I know several of you wanted to talk about it. Raise your hand if you have any questions. What difficulty is this question? It looks like it's a difficulty 2. Okay, Ryan, go ahead.
Hey Ben, quick question.
Yep.
I accidentally, well, not accidentally, I intended to, but I made a mistake of choosing D. And you said the word ought is what steered you away from answer choice D. So what is it about the word ought? Like you said, it's something about the word should or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah, exactly. So answers A, D, and E, although we'll just start with D for now, talk about what should happen, right? Like if I said to you, you should wake up every morning at 6 a.m., that's a very different claim than you do wake up every morning at 6 a.m. When I say you should do that, we have no clue what you actually do. And when I say that you do that, we have no clue what you should actually do. Right? It's like they're two different universes. So talking about what should happen versus talking about what is happening is something the LSAT loves to test all the time. And answers A, D, and E are alluding to what should happen. But the passages weren't about what should happen. Neither Antonio nor Marla talked about whether you should live a life of moderation or not. They just talked about things that happen if you do or how you do it. Radina, go ahead.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I actually got rid of D because I thought they kind of agreed over this. So I don't know if this was a good way of thinking about it, but it said that or to go too far. Like I thought that it's good to branch off. That's what they were both kind of agreeing on.
Okay.
If that makes
So,
sense. Does
yeah.
that make sense?
Yes, but I don't think that's the right reason for getting rid of this. So let's talk about this for a half second. Let's just talk about whenever you're doing a disagree question, if you have any sort of confusion during the test or after when you're reviewing, break it down. So deal with one person at a time. For example, Antonio. Does Antonio say that you should live a life of moderation by not deviating from the middle course?
Like he never said like what you should or shouldn't do. He didn't really take a position.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah. Okay.
So Antonio does do one thing. Antonio says you can live a life of moderation by not deviating. And then Antonio tells us two things that will happen if you do that. And they sound a little negative, right? Losing the joy of spontaneity and missing opportunities. Those sound like negative things. So we might infer loosely, or we might speculate that Antonio thinks living a life of moderation is not a good thing, but Antonio never says that. And Antonio could go on and say, but it's still the best course of action because there's all this other shit that's going to happen if you don't do this. Right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that alone is enough to kill this answer because we need an answer in which one person clearly agrees and the other clearly disagrees. Lex, question.
So it's not really a question. It's more of a statement. I guess in my brain, and I find myself doing this a lot, I took middle course and tried to fit it into Marla's statement, you know? So I was like, oh, what's something like can I take middle course and moderation and relate them to each other? And then that's how I came up with D, and I was like, like she's saying that a person shouldn't really, I guess how often a person should deviate from a middle course, but then it didn't make sense in my head until after you answered it. So it's like, that's where I get stuck up on, is trying to substitute in my words, like paraphrasing. And this where paraphrasing becomes a bit difficult for me because sometimes it's hard to understand interchange words.
You're absolutely right. I mean, part of reframing what the test is saying in your own words does demand that you reframe it in a way that doesn't misstate the test, right? A lot of times people oversimplify what they read. I'm glad you're trying to restate what you read in your own words, but you want to restate it as simply as possible without losing the key details in the sentence that distinguish it from some other claim. It's a tough skill to develop, but you can, and as you do, you will get so much better at this test. Okay, great questions. Thank you.